Hello, hello. Welcome everyone to the Mango Publishing Heart Wisdom panel. I'm Sherry Richert Belul, author of Say It Now, 33 Creative Ways to Say I Love You to the most important people in your life. And really excited today to have Elise Marie Collins and Sara Zeff Geber here. Welcome, welcome to our authors, and welcome to all of you who are here with us. Today we're going to be talking about aging well, and I think it's going to be such a great conversation. I wanted to start off with a short quote from Sara's book that kind of caught my eye, and it seemed appropriate to begin. Sara says, planning is difficult, if not impossible, if we dread our future. If we see aging as a time of new horizons and prepare ourselves for the inevitable challenges, we will be in a much better shape to face the future. The older we get, the more dramatically our lack of planning in our earlier days shows up. And I loved that because I thought, here we all are in our earlier days right now, right? Because someday are going to be later days. And I just thought that was a great way to start and to get ourselves in that mindset of really looking forward to aging and to hearing what Sara and Elise and all of you have to share. So Sara, we'll start with you, and I'll just have you share your book and just let us know a little bit about why. Why did you write this book?
Sure. This is my book, Essential Retirement Planning for Solo Agers. And the reason I wrote this book is because when I was about, I was somewhere in my mid to late 50s, I started noticing that a bunch of my friends and colleagues and just people that I was running into here and there were spending a tremendous amount of time taking care of their aging parents. And these parents at that point were probably in their mid to late 80s, early 90s. And all of a sudden, they were having a hard time managing life as they had been a decade before. So I saw people flying back and forth across country and spending weekends and trying to get their parents moved into some place where they would be safer, and all kinds of different things going on. So I was having a glass of wine with a friend of mine, and she and I both do not have kids. And I said to her, Sandy, who's going to do that for us? And of course, the answer was crickets, as they say. There isn't anybody to do that for people who don't have children. And if you look around you, you'll notice, and some of you have probably had this experience in your own families of taking care of grandma, taking care of grandpa. If your own parents are getting up into that age, you've probably had some of that experience. My parents and my husband's parents both passed on when we were younger. So we weren't experiencing it personally, but I watched it going on around me. So I did some research and discovered that absolutely nobody was writing about it. Nobody was even thinking about it. And I had started doing some retirement coaching at that point. And that's kind of how I got interested in the whole field of aging and preparing for aging. So I thought, this might be a bigger issue than we realize. And when I looked into it, I discovered some research that had demonstrated that the baby boom generation had almost 20% solo agers, meaning that, and I define that a little differently now than I used to, but 19.4% of baby boomer women did not bear children. Now, that's a lot. And for obvious reasons, we can't measure men quite the same way, but the measure of women is quite telling. And you can probably figure out why, because in their late 60s, early 60s, all the pill, pressure from government and from women all over the world to empower women more. So doors were opening to prestigious colleges, to careers that had never been open for women. So it's no mystery why that happened, but it happened. So baby boomers have almost twice the rate of childlessness. I like to call it child-freeness, that previous generations had. So to wind this up, there wasn't anything written on it so far. And I thought, somebody needs to bring this to the attention of the world. And that's why I wrote the book.
Oh, thank you, Sara. Wow. That's a startling statistic.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah. Obviously a great need for what you're teaching.
Yeah.
So wonderful. Elise, welcome.
Thank you.
Question for you. Why did you write this book and share it with us?
Well, I'm a yoga teacher and a student of Ayurveda, which is the ancient Indian health science. So it's a traditional health and wellness and self-care, I want to just say practice, ways to take care of yourself. So someone came to me and said, you should write a book called Super Ager. And I actually didn't know what that was, but the name just made me perk up my ears. And similar to Sara, I was like, I don't know what that is, but I know I want to be a super ager. I just intuitively was gravitating towards super ager. What is that? Because I had always felt, now I look back and I thought I did have a grandmother that lived a long and healthy life, and my grandfather. I was around many grandparents, which might not have been as normative for others of my generation. Our life expectancy is increasing, and so these trends are really coming to the forefront, as Sara mentioned. Taking care of older parents, solo agers are trending up. So I was really interested in how can I bring yoga wisdom, simple practices that don't cost a lot of money, because these traditions are not, yoga and exercises, and not just physical exercises, but mental meditations, breathing, all these things. We know the science now, and that the traditional wisdom tells us that this is going to help us and support us. So I wanted to put this all together so people could understand it, and also bring this information to those that maybe weren't so interested in yoga, but were looking for ways to age well, as this panel is about. And so I wrote the book, and then I was so interested that I actually got a degree in gerontology. And that's when I learned a lot about the research that Sara's mentioning, solo agers. It's a huge trend because the birth rate for women is declining. Women live longer. I'm really interested in intergenerational relationships and what we call the sandwich generation. And that is the generation where you've got older parents and you may have young children too. So that's a little different than solo agers.
Oh, Elise, where did you get your gerontology degree?
At USC.
Okay. The Davis School.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Sara, back to you. One of the questions I really want to know from each of you is if you could just give us your number one or first and second tips for your own self-care to ensure that you age the way that you want to, aging well.
I guess for me, aging well means aging healthfully and planfully. So that I'm really looking ahead and saying, where do I want to be in 10 years? Where do I want to be in 20 years? And making plans for that. It means making sure that my estate planning is up to date. It's making sure that our financial plan is solid. And also this is kind of a three-legged stool for me: the finances, the legal, and then the third is the social network, making sure that we have a robust ongoing social network, and that my friends aren't all my age. So those are really important things for me. And I think in general, I've been living a healthful life all along, and I intend to continue to do that with getting plenty of exercise, being outdoors as much as possible, and eating right. So, that's kind of the sum of it for me.
Let me ask you, especially around that social aspect, obviously, since we've been in the pandemic, Have there been any special ways that you've kept that social life, your social connections alive and thriving?
Yeah, of course, through Zooms. Um, we have a group of us. There's 12 of us that used to um, get together periodically in, twos and fours and that kind of thing. But always on New Year's Day, we would get together at one of our houses and talk about the year that has just passed and
Mm.
what we look forward to in the year coming. And there was one woman that always took notes, and so we could review what we said last year. So that group started doing a Zoom. At first, it was every week because we were just all, So, and then it tapered off to every 2 weeks. And finally, we all kind of found our footing. And then it kind of tapered off to, well, catch as catch can. And then the other thing is, depending on the weather, during the summer, we were doing a tremendous amount of socially distanced outdoor gathering.
Yeah.
So that those were the two main things that were happening in our lives.
I love it. Thank you. Thanks for sharing those. I like your three-legged stool. That's a good thing to remember. Elise, how about you? About your first number one and two of the things that you're doing?
I would echo the social aspect of aging. That for me was one of the most surprising things that I learned in my research, because I'm a yoga teacher and I teach people how to do asanas, physical poses, breathing, eat healthy, get plenty of sleep. But the social interactions that we have, they not only help your brain, because you don't realize, even on Zoom, and we notice it on Zoom sometimes because when we're looking at people's faces, it's a little different than in person, but your brain is registering what people's reactions are. And that's a huge cognitive stimulation to the brain. There's one researcher who talks about how we should have relationships with close friends and family. You can also have, I like to say, family of choice. That's something important we studied in gerontology school, because you may not have children, but you could have a family of choice, someone who acts as a family member, but they're not necessarily blood relatives. That was something inspiring for me, that many aging adults have thought of this idea of family of choice. In the African American community, it's also kin, especially communities that weren't as supported. In the Bay Area, we have the gay and lesbian, now LGBTQ, but back in the day, family of choice was a huge thing because many were cast out of their families. So they needed to have a family of choice for similar reasons. So that was something I studied in a class called The Aging Family. So I think the social network is incredibly important. Oh, and I wanted to say, this researcher talks about having close family members or close friends, and also people you don't know, which has been harder in the COVID, especially with masks, because when you're used to somebody, right, we're used to the people we know, and sometimes we finish their sentences and we think, oh, she's thinking that, or I live with my mom, so I'm like, oh, my mom's doing that thing again, right? But and she may not be. So that's why we need to interact with strangers, because it's actually good for our brains, because we're not as going ahead and thinking, oh, they're thinking this. With strangers, we have to, we say something, then we wonder, how are they reacting? Our brain is spinning. So many neurons are firing to try to interact with a stranger, because we don't have that familiarity. So I love to say that, because that fascinates me, that social aspect. And it can tie in with yoga, because I now teach online classes, and I've taught some groups where we spend 5 weeks together, and people really liked being in a group. As Sarah was saying, you might have friends that are groups, but this was a group of strangers that I took through the holidays, and I called it Sacred Season. So you could come to my yoga class, but this was a special class, and people liked just being in a group. So I think joining different groups, maybe with your interests, or yeah, and on Zoom, because it's hard to define, but I think we've all felt that even if we don't know people, we can still feel part of a group on Zoom. And I'm also an intuitive person, so I think there's some kind of gestalt where we're here together and we feel this connectedness. That's part of these Wednesday wisdom panels. It's a place where we can, open our hearts and connect.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that, Elise, because I was thinking that when you were talking about that being with strangers and how that helps the brain, to activate in certain ways. And I was looking around because we have some people that are brand new today that I'm so glad to see here, and also some friends, from the past year since we've been doing this. But that what you said too about the gestalt that occurs, and I love, I was saying right before we officially started that with these Wednesday panels, that there's a certain intimacy that happens. And inevitably, I hope, people feel a part of the group, and to feel like you're here for a reason. Like for whatever reason that we all showed up today, we get to be, it almost feels like to me like a social club as much as, an author panel. I love that. I love the things you shared. And I love that you both really talked about the social aspects. Yeah.
Can I ask something to both of them?
Sure. Jump on in, Angela.
See, this past year, my father was in assisted living and I was his only person. We're really, really close. And the quarantine has been just so difficult, for any of the seniors in the assisted living. And they were, sequestered to their rooms. They couldn't interact anymore. They couldn't do any of the stuff that they did. And I was wondering if either of you had any suggestions. Unfortunately, my father passed away from COVID, and we just had his service a week ago.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, and I didn't want to bring it down.
No, that's all right.
The point is, it was a real challenge all year. And all three of you have so much about this, because I had to get very creative with him to, keep him going. He had dementia, but still knew me, and, it was just short-term memory. So, I would talk to him all day long, keep him thinking about the past and like, oh, Dad, remember your cats? Remember, this? Oh, yes. And get him, connection going, because they lost a sense of connection. And the people that were alone, who didn't have, a daughter that was always there. And I saw that before the pandemic, that so many didn't have advocates, and we used to pull them in and really work with them, like, oh, come over here, and and just make them feel a part of the family. And it's just so important. So I was wondering if you had any suggestions moving forward, because this can go in and out, who knows, and just in general for seniors that are sort of secluded, on ways that they can interact and get mentally, emotionally stimulated.
Yeah. There's a lot to say on that. First of all, it's really important to realize that all of these senior living communities were caught off guard. Nobody was prepared for this, and they did the best they could under the circumstances. They've all improved. They've all improved their facilities. They've improved their guidelines for visitors. They've improved the airflow. They've done everything they could. Senior living is unfortunately at its lowest ebb ever now. I'm sure that will turn around, but and they're looking at that. I mean, I happen to belong to a kind of a think tank about the future of senior living, and it's a challenge. And Angela, I praise you to the hills for doing what you did and hanging in there with your father. You did everything you could, and the community where he was hopefully was one of the ones that was proactive and did as much as they could. I don't think if this happens again, I don't think it will be quite as horrible. because these communities are going to be better prepared for it. You probably, Elise, have something to add to that too.
Yeah, what I wanted to add is I want to just everything you're saying as well. I echo. I think well, I was finishing my degree in May, and so I was studying online, and I was right in the middle of it, in the thick of it, in March, April, May. And actually, one of my colleagues in as a student at USC School of Gerontology was in charge of, I think, a huge amount, or like say 30 to 50 senior living centers in Texas, because people study from all over, literally all over the world at USC School of Gerontology.
Yeah.
And so we were hearing firsthand what was happening. And it was just like, it was so overwhelming to hear a lot of the people that were working in senior living in different communities and working with seniors through my school. And I still get a lot of information from them. And I also want to applaud Angela, because it sounds like you were very creative and heartfelt and thinking on your feet. And we can get overwhelmed. And then that's when we panic or go into fear, and then we're not being creative. And I think that's so important, because one of the things we learn as we age, it's like, I think of our brain like a tree. And so the tree is, it's kind of like the aging is like the fall. The leaves are kind of falling off, but we still have a beautiful tree that will regenerate. And so how can we keep that creativity, and how can we keep ourselves in a good mindset? And it sounds like Angela was doing that. I feel like I could just, every question you ask, I could just keep talking the whole time, but I'll just say two more things. I'm sure we all feel like that on panels, but I don't want to just keep going on and on. But music is great for anyone with memory issues or cognitive decline, because music affects a different part of our brain. So I would suggest that to my friends with parents that are experiencing cognitive decline or any kind of dementia. There's a lot of information on music. I can send it to you if you're interested. And I thought of one other thing, but now it's escaping me, so I'll just come back to it.
My father was a concert violinist.
Oh, wow.
And the sad part was when he couldn't play anymore. And he would keep trying. He would forget. The nice thing about dementia is sometimes you forget some of your limitations. And he'd try again, and we'd bring him the violins, and he'd do it a little while, but he just couldn't. And then he just stopped wanting to hear the music. So instead we talk about it. And I wish I had known about Sherry's book then, early on when this happened, because I would have just gotten a ton of them and given them out to the families of the people there, because this is when you had to be creative. We would do little gifts. I took pictures of all of us and put them all, gave them to them and put it all over his room. You go outside the window, you do all kinds of things, that you can, but you had so many really neat things in your book. And it's that would be, I think, a great solution for so many of, have the grandchildren make these creative things and send them and, things like that. So yeah.
That is such a good point, Angela. I have yet to get Sherry's book, but I am now determined that I'm going to, because as you get older, people leave your life for a lot of reasons, but sometimes they leave your life because it's their turn to transition, and then they're gone out of your life permanently. And it's so important for people to understand how they can express their love to someone who is leaving, someone who's transitioning. And one of the things I've done with several people that I've lost, and when I've known that they were going, is I've written them a letter. This is what you've meant to me over the years, and the things I remember. But I bet Sherry's got like dozens of other ideas like that, and I'm going to get the book and start sharing those.
The most challenging thing at the end was when it was Christmas, and that's when he was in the hospital, and he had gotten COVID from not the assisted living, even though that did get it too. It was that time when everyone had just all the elderly homes and nursing homes. So was being in the hospital and not being able to see him. Not,
Wow.
they didn't, not even for Christmas would they allow flowers or a
Yeah.
stuffed animal, a card, nothing. And so, and he was pretty weak, but he knew what was going on, I believed. And so I would just call each nurse on call and just say, listen, please. And I say, tell him his daughter loves him. She called. And I would just say, and then the next, I drove them nuts probably, but then I said, tell him his granddaughter Zoe called, and just keep telling him in his ear, your family loves you.
Well, good for you.
And that's all you could do then. It was so hard, and that's when you really get pushed to being creative as much as possible. But, it was a challenge for sure. But yes, I am very excited about Sherry's book, and Elise and Sara. Oh, so much information, and I'm loving it.
Thank you, Angela. Thanks for being here. And I'm so sorry about your dad. It just sounds like you did everything you possibly could. I know the other two said this too, but just we applaud you for just all those creative ways that you expressed your love, that you showed up.
It never feels like enough, though.
Never does ever. It never does ever. Elise, was there something else I thought you wanted
I
to
did think of it, and it kind of ties to that. It's never enough, but I really believe meditation and the letter helping also helps, because when we're writing, we're involving our body. So if you're not a meditator, I really recommend Sherry's book, and her exercises are wonderful because they do open our hearts. And meditation, I believe that there's a kind of an internet of the heart, an internet of spirit, so to speak. You can call it whatever you like, because I don't always want to force anybody into my beliefs or what, so whatever your beliefs are, I think there's a kind of an internet. And I believe we do need those, it's wonderful that you had nurses, you thought to tell the nurses to tell your father, your daughter called and she loves you, your granddaughter loves you, because that there is the physical aspect, like hearing with your ears. We take in the world through our senses. But I think there's another that I'll just call it the internet of the spirit.
Oh, yeah.
And when we meditate, we're connecting. And I think I've experienced synchronicities and different things that tell me that I am connected. So it's challenging. And I think that studying aging also connects us to life and death and the fragility of it. So we're all doing the best we can, and to be gentle on ourselves. So yeah.
Yeah, meditation was hugely helpful because that's all I had, really at that point. And boy, did it help. That power of, thought and spirit was amazing. So I'm going to keep quiet because I've taken up too much time.
This is beautiful. No, I love where our conversation. That's why I said, like, we never know quite where we're gonna go, but it's always a beautiful journey. I wanted to just say, I know Elise and Sara that you both brought a little something to read. If it feels like it's still something that you want to bring into the conversation right now, we could do that now. Or if you just want to keep going, if there's more you want to say about this, I'll just turn it over to you guys. Sara, what do you think?
Gosh, I don't know. I could read or not.
Well, why don't you read? I think it'd be great. I always love for people to hear a little bit of the author's voices, because that can be really great if you don't yet have the books, which I know. Thank you, Victoria. She's been posting the links. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So Sara, why don't you start, and then we'll have Elise read what she brought.
Okay. I'm actually going to read a story. Obviously, the book is mostly a kind of a how-to book, but it's riddled with stories. And I start out with a story that happened to some friends of mine, and it's kind of been a keystone of of helping people understand why this information is so important. This is a story of a couple by the name of Fred and Hildy. Fred and Hildy don't have children, and they didn't plan for their later years, but they got very lucky in the end. My colleague and friend Andrea Gallagher shared their story with me and offered to let me use their real names. She and her husband Peter, who do not themselves have children, learned some great lessons from it, and so did I. Andrea and Peter had recently moved into a new home and invited a few of their closest neighbors over for cocktails and to introduce themselves. Fred, who was 86 at the time, and Hildy, who was 89, were the oldest couple on the block, having lived there in the neighborhood since it was developed. And that was over 40 years. They arrived at the party a little early and stayed throughout. As they got to know Fred and Hildy better, Peter and Andrea started helping them with small chores like putting up holiday decorations and things like that. They also learned that Fred and Hildy had no children and no close relatives. Early one Saturday morning, about 18 months later, Hildy called and asked if one of them could take Fred to the hospital for a minor procedure. Hildy did not drive. She was mostly wheelchair bound because of macular degeneration and crippling arthritis in her legs. What was to be a quick outpatient surgery for Fred turned into a week-long stay at the hospital. Frustrated and concerned at the turn of events, Fred asked Andrew and Peter to sleep over at his house so Hildy would not be afraid. How could they say no? Every day they took Hildy to see Fred, and either Peter or Andrea stayed with Hildy overnight. One of those nights, Hildy came down the hall in her motorized wheelchair at 3:00 in the morning, fully dressed, and announced, "I want to take you kids to breakfast." After a week, Fred was able to leave the hospital and return home. About that point, it became clear to Andrea and Peter that Fred had been acting as a caregiver to Hildy in recent years as she became more and more disabled, both mentally and physically. Many other neighbors shared their relief that Peter and Andrea had come along when they did. They had all known that Fred and Hildy would need help, and no one knew who was going to help them. Andrea and Peter began to prepare meals, take them to doctor appointments, and over time saw both of them through several more of Fred's hospital stays. Over the next few years, watching over Hildy and Fred became part of Andrea and Peter's lives. With the help of an aide, they oversaw all of the older couple's daily needs. When Hildy was medically confirmed with dementia, Fred was devastated. They had been married for 63 years, and his life partner was slipping away before his eyes. A few months later, Fred developed sepsis and ended up in intensive care fighting for his life. Upon recovering from that episode, he recognized that he and Hildy could no longer depend solely on each other for their safety and well-being. He asked Andrea and Peter to be their legal agents with permission to take over medical and financial decision-making for both of them, and ultimately to be the executors of their wills. This was a huge responsibility, yet they felt honored to be able to help these two people that they had grown to love. Hildy died in 2009, and Fred a year and 5 days later. Peter and Andrea often tell people of how they adopted their elderly neighbors, and though they were often overwhelmed by the work that it entailed, they were glad to have been there to help avert a crisis. Fred and Hildy were extremely lucky to find at the 11th hour two trustworthy and caring people. We can all imagine what might have happened to them had Andrea and Peter not been so charitable and accommodating, or if they had seen their vulnerable neighbors as easy prey and taken advantage of a chance to siphon funds from their accounts, or worse yet, been abusive in their treatment of them. So thankfully, the story of Fred and Hildy had a happy ending, as well as an additional bonus. Andrea and Peter learned through their relationship with Fred and Hildy that intergenerational relationships are one of the keys to survival for those without children. The experience motivated them to expand their social sphere to include people of many ages and spurred them to do some additional planning for their own future. So I think that passage kind of sets the scene for what those of us without children, or, I include in Solo Agers today people who do have children, but maybe they live 6,000 miles away. Or in a lot of cases, I say, or maybe they're sons and not daughters. Because it's just, you look around you and it's the adult daughters that rush in and take care of things. That doesn't mean that sons can't do it or won't do it. I've seen examples of where they did, but it usually falls to the adult daughters. In fact, there's an organization forming called the Adult Daughters. To provide help for people who don't actually have adult daughters. Anyway, so that's it. It sets the scene for why this is so important.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. And I know, we could talk for weeks about, because there's so much in your book, right? So much. I do hope that anyone who this is touching will definitely get your book if they don't have it already, to find out everything that you have to share. Elise, yeah, how about you? I know you brought something as well.
You're muted, Elise.
I'm muted because there was background noise.
Is that your dog?
Actually, not my dog, but I also live with my parents. And so we are the oldest family on the block as well. We've been here the longest. And I actually I was driving with my mom, as I said earlier, and we were driving around and she said, oh, that house over there, it was a few blocks from where we live. She said that house used to have really high hedges and a strange older family lived there. I was like, have you ever thought maybe that's what people think of our family? And she said, yeah. So we were laughing because I think it speaks to how we all think we're not going to really age. And then when you're there, you just, like my mom was like, a strange older family. Like, maybe that's what people think of our family. So anyway, I like to have levity because I think we're all in this together, and humor helps. And I joke around with my parents a lot. So they're serious topics, but I think if we're always in seriousness, it does. Yeah, that helps me. Meditation and being a little lighthearted. So the story I have is about actually a yoga teacher. She has since passed away, but it's a story. You'll see what it's about. And she's a yoga teacher in India, and her name is Nanamal. And this story is called Good Form. Nanamal, age 99, of Tamil Nadu, India, has been practicing yoga since the age of 3. She says, my grandparents worked in the fields, and then they would come home and do yoga on a mat, and I joined them. She easily does headstand and shoulder stand, yoga poses that many cannot do at any age. Following a traditional yoga routine, she rises at 5 a.m. to chant and greet the sun. She eats a simple vegetarian diet of greens, grains, and fruits. She shares her love of yoga with all of her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, who all teach and help run the Ozone Yoga Studio in Tamil Nadu. In 1995, Nanamal traveled with her grandchildren to a yoga competition. I always have to pause here and say, yes, there's actually yoga competitions. It sounds weird, but they really do exist. So she traveled with her grandchildren to this competition, only to see one of the participants disqualified for bad yoga form. She did not agree with the ruling of the judges, and Nanamal took action. She says, I disagreed with the decision and went on stage to voice my opinion, only to be insulted by the judges as an old woman who did not know anything. Then she got on stage and performed 10 different yoga poses, including the peacock, which is where you're balancing on your elbows like this. It's really hard to do that pose. You gotta have some serious core strength. So then she received a standing ovation. And since that day, Nanamal decided to participate in yoga competitions herself. And she has made 200 50 first place finishes in yoga competition. And last year, this was in 2019, no, actually 2017, excuse me. 2017, she was recognized on International Yoga Day in India, along with another teacher that is also passed away, Dao Portion Lynch, as one of the two, they were both the two oldest yoga teachers in the world. Both of them passed away, and Nanamal was, I think she was 101, and Dao Portion Lynch was maybe 102, something like that. So she has since passed away, but I was inspired by her story because she grew up in a yoga lifestyle. Not all of us had that, but we can start to, that's another thing about community, is to surround yourself with people that are supportive, like neighbors, get to know your neighbors. That is so important. My parents, before COVID, they would have parties, and another neighbor would do that to invite the neighbors and create this tradition so we all know each other, because a lot of the, people move a lot in the modern era. And again, some people they might have children, but they're far away, or there's so many things going on. So I like that story because it speaks to the yoga lifestyle, and also speaks to ageism, which I think we can all understand at any age. We've all been treated not so, we've been just judged for our age, whether it's too young, too old. It's part of our culture. So
I love
we want
that.
to get rid of it.
Thank you, Elise. Thank you. Brenda said, and it's true, it's so inspiring. That's such an inspiring story. I love it. I think this would be a good time to open it up and see if anybody wants to ask a question or share. Monk, I think that you had something that you had wanted to bring into the conversation, if you still want to.
So I had thought about this topic. I don't always either get the email about the topic or look at what it is, but in this case I did, and I thought about it a little bit, and I had some ideas that I jotted down, and I'm delighted to say that nearly all of them have already been spoken, which forgive the way this sounds, but I'm impressed by that. And I'm impressed by it, not because I have all the answers in any way, but because I come to these questions from a very particular perspective. So I don't always expect that there will be intersection with other perspectives, or, particularly I'm thinking at this point about the yoga thing, because of course, the Taoist practices are a bit different. There were like a couple of small things that I thought I might add as grace points to all this really meaty and wonderful advice and stories and insights that have already been shared. One, I think, is the importance of spending time in nature. So I figure that Elise, having studied gerontology, will have come across these kinds of studies in abundance, but there are lots of them which show that even the presence of a house plant makes a difference. Of course, it's maybe not as great as being able to go take a walk in the mountains, but which is obviously not something everybody can do. But some kind of nature, and that links to an ancillary point about the presence of a pet. So there's a lot made of, the companionship of a pet. And if you have a dog, the fact that the dog forces you to get up and walk sometimes when you otherwise might want to go to sleep. And so I think the presence of a pet, but there's another dimension to the presence of the pet aside from the exercise and the emotional interaction. And that is that pets are a version of connecting with other. So they are a version of connecting with nature. And, of course, I like turtles, and I wrote a book about turtles, and I have a house full of turtles. But turtles are a longevity, sign and symbol in Taoist culture. But the fact is that, and I explained this to my scientist son, who is a very ardent conservationist and sometimes takes me to task for having any kind of animals, in captivity. And I said, look, I view this conservation elements aside because I happen to keep turtles that are either extinct or about to be in the wild, and I participate in global breeding programs. So that's a separate question. But I view the keeping of the turtle as a compassion exercise. So what the compassion exercises do for the brain, I think, is very important. And it's much the same as our exposure to nature in terms of taking a walk does for our sense of the non-dual, our sense of belonging to something larger. So that was one point. Another small point was, the vegan diet. A few of you talked or touched on the idea of eating a healthy diet, but very specifically, there's just an overabundance of information about what the plant-based diet does for lengthening the telomeres, and never mind what it does for the earth and the larger sort of cosmic balance and harmony question. And setting aside, the cruelties of factory farming, and as another one of my fellow monks, Matthew Richard, makes a very good point and says, if you can eat without causing suffering, eat and be healthy and happy, and eat a good, happy meals and delicious stuff without causing unnecessary suffering to another sentient being, why not do that? So why not do it, right? So that's all, grist for the mill. I think some people find genetically that it's difficult, in which case, you can eat an animal product once a week or something, but I think maybe a little more emphasis on that in thinking about aging. Meditation, which was again touched on, whether you have a practice of meditation or yoga or Tai Chi, obviously I favor Tai Chi because that's where I made my career, but earlier in my life I did yoga and enjoyed it. Three last things, I guess, one very fast. 9 hours of sleep is required by the brain. It's not a weirdo luxury. The brain has a system for cleaning itself, the lymphatic system. And if you don't lie down and sleep and let your the brain's version of that lymphatic system wash away the toxins, you get dementia and all this other stuff. And there's more and more and more studies now linking this. So when people hear that I try to sleep 9 hours, they go, wow, nice. Life of leisure. How luxurious of you. This is a perversion of our natural state. And I have much to say about all those perversions, which I won't do here. But I will say that the idea that it's better to stay up and watch 3 or 4 hours of TV than it is to get sleep is a very strange notion and is incongruent with healthy aging. So if you care about this stuff, don't do that. If you have to divert yourself before sleep, read a book, I say, preaching to the choir. Yes, no TV, hopefully at all, but preferably not at night. Accepting that change is the inevitable way of things and is the only constant there is. And competently adapting, adaptive competence in aging makes a huge difference. Just not getting stuck on the way it was and the way you like to do it. This is, you have to police your inner behavior and notice when you're doing this. And, if the word is be tough on yourself in this regard, okay, you can also be kind on yourself in this regard, but notice that. One more thing, I suppose, that goes with everything else. Music was already mentioned, which is a great and powerful tool. Please remember that it's not all about you. This is also very helpful in aging well, and it leads to many things that everybody has talked about today, especially connections to community and compassionate action. But these things do benefit you in your brain. And I hate to see the wonderful Buddhist, I'm not a Buddhist, but the wonderful Buddhist concept of karma perverted by our new age culture to mean do the right thing because it's good for you. And I find that sells us all short and is a perversion of a great tradition. That's not what karma means at all. So putting that aside, just please remember that if you focus on it not being about you, you will find that you are led in many very helpful directions. I guess that's it.
Very good.
Thank you, Monk. Elise, I thought you were going to jump in. Did you have something you wanted to respond to, Monk?
Well, I do have a chapter in my book on sleep, and I 100% agree with sleep. I actually help people. That's one of the things that I work with people on, because they might come to my yoga class, but if someone is suffering from insomnia, or especially as we get older, sometimes sleep can become more evasive, and I don't think it's an indulgence. There's so many things that distract us from sleep. So I want to just underline that. And sorry, there's some drilling going on outside. I also just wanted to mention the blue zones, because traditional cultures are where there's 5 blue zones, and I mentioned them in my book. There are 5 places around the world where there are more centenarians percentage-wise than any other place. And all of these places, except for one, are geographically isolated. So they're places where people aren't watching TV, they're honoring their elders, they're living in a more traditional way. But this blue zone I always like to point out that gives me hope is, anybody know where there's one in the United States? Where there's a blue zone? Okay, Angela.
Loma Linda.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you don't know, Loma Linda is a blue zone, and that's because of the Seventh-day Adventist. And they are, I don't know if they're 100% vegetarian, vegan, but many, many of them are. And I like to remind people of Loma Linda, because it's not, I mean, it's a religious community, but they've intentionally isolated themselves from the outside culture. They're really into community. So what it tells me is that it's possible. It's possible to live in LA and also, surround yourself with like-minded people, create families of choice, create a community that maybe doesn't stay, maybe watch Netflix sometimes, but not every night.
Thank you. Thanks, Elise. Sarah,
Yeah.
did you
So
have a response?
I have one more thing, if I may.
I just want to see if Sarah had anything to jump in.
No,
No. Okay. Did anybody, let me just check, Monk, because you gave out a lot of great points. I just wanted to see if anybody else had anything they wanted to respond to all of those wonderful ideas you brought into the conversation.
I mean, I could go on and on about it, but I think Monk wanted to say something.
Oh, I didn't want to say anything else. I just wanted to show a book that I thought everybody would enjoy, because we're talking about all these mistakes that humankind has made to lead us to this terrible place, which is, the going away from agriculture and all the other stuff that the blue zones show the return to. This is a particularly excellent book on this subject, which addresses the fact that, I hope I could send focus for everybody.
I'm not
It's
able,
called
maybe you could, yeah, thanks, Monk. We can't, I
called
can't.
Pristine Affluence by Olivia Cohn. I didn't write it, but it's a great book about how many different things we do that are bad for us that have come about in the last 10,000 years, and how we could start to undo those. So.
Thank you. I see oh, go ahead. Angela
I
was,
was say to Elise, I was fascinated by the blue zones and the things that you found. One of the things obviously was community throughout all of them, that sense of community besides the nutrition and, that aspect of it. But I found it interesting that in Japan, that's where women live the longest. And like I think it was it Sardinia that the men. So I wanted to know what the two differences you found between those, like why did women shine in Japan more, and why did men do so well in Sardinia? Was there anything significant that you saw?
Yeah, well, in Sardinia, the men are shepherds, and so they walk and walk and walk. I think, and in terrain, it's kind of like San Francisco, maybe even more steep. And because there's not really that much to do for, for work. So most of the men are shepherds. So they're walking tremendous, I think it's like average 6 or 7 miles a day and continuing until later in life. And then the men are, like, I always say there's a calendar. It's not a pinup calendar in Sardinia. It's like the centenarians have a calendar. They are celebrated and they go to the pub. So there's a calendar instead of, like, who's the coolest centenarian? So everybody is a different month. And after they do their work, they all go to the pub and hang out and socialize. So there's a very strong community culture there. I think that's really important for men because men can speak for themselves, but I think there's a different socialization where you want to, in the West, more like, don't share your feelings. Yeah, and now I'll just quickly answer because I love hearing from Sarah too. I don't want to say everything, but Japan, my guess about the women are, there is another community aspect to Okinawa in Japan where women live the longest. And it's called the Moai. I may be pronouncing it wrong, but it forms small groups where people pool resources, economic resources, and back in the day, farming resources. And you move through life with this group of people, 5 or 6 people. I think that helps. And women, yeah, I don't know exactly why women in Japan live longer, but it could be, I don't know enough. I don't want to create any stereotypes, but it could be a cultural thing.
I want
Maybe
to
the
bring up something
diet.
really quickly.
Okay,
if I may.
so I hear a bunch of people talking. I'll just.
I was asking if I could bring up something quickly.
Jump on in, Brenda.
Okay. So about 8 years ago, I read a New York Times Magazine article that I loved and read and recommend. It's called The Island Where People Forgot to Die. And a Greek man from was born on Ikaria, a little island in Greece, moved to Michigan, lived there for many years, and was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And he decided that he would live out his last few months in his home island of Ikaria. And he went back, he reconnected with his people. They ate simple food, like lots of greens, the Mediterranean diet, teas made of weeds and greens, drank a lot of red wine, hung out with their friends, talked and told stories and drank wine into the middle of the night. And he his cancer just went away. And like that island, Ikaria, has like it's its own blue zone where there's a lot of people that are quite old. And I just thought that was such an inspiring story that he went there like to live out his last few months. He had less than a year to live, and then he lived many, 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 many more years.
Ah, that is so great.
Yay. I love that.
I became like obsessed with that for a while. And there you can actually get the red wine that's made in Ikaria, Ikaria. There's not much of it, but I remember like the last time I was in New York, there was a Greek restaurant, and I asked them if they had wine from the island of Ikaria, and they looked at me like, "Ooh, she knows the secret," and they did. Like, so it's worth tracking down.
Brenda, I love that. I love that. Thank you. I see that we've gone a little bit past our time. Before we head out, I just wanted to check back. Sarah, was there any last words that you wanted to offer to us today?
It's for me, and from everything I've studied and seen, it's all about community. It's just all about community. For me, it's not so much, all those other things are important, but having purpose in your life and having a community it's everything.
Thank you. Wow, I love that. Elise, any last couple words before we head out? You're muted, sweetie.
You're muted.
You're
Just
muted.
wanted my
There you
book. I wanted my book to speak for itself. And, the last word of wisdom I'll say is your purpose could be community, or it could be just waving at people. There was an older woman in Okinawa, and she would get up every day and wait for the school children to drive by or walk by and just wave and say, hey, hello, have a great day. So your purpose doesn't have to be something, changing the world. It could be bringing light to people by just waving and smiling.
I love that. I love that. And that also leads me to one of my favorite things to point out before we close, which is that showing up here really matters. And I just really want to thank each of you. I hope you felt that. I hope you know that, whether you've joined in by verbally joining the conversation or you were just, showing up, but that you really matter. And as it's been pointed out over and over again today about community, I know for myself, I've been the recipient of your joy and your energy week after week. So thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you to our wonderful authors, Sara and Elise, for everything that you brought. Thank you to all of you who joined in the conversation. Thank you, Victoria, for everything you do to keep us all organized and running smoothly. And Brenda, as always, thank you for being the one to bring us all together.
I know a good community when I see one.
And thank you, Sherry, for pulling this together.
You're very welcome. It's definitely my pleasure. We're here every Wednesday with a different topic. Come join us. We welcome all of you back again.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Good to see you, Elizabeth, Priscilla, Angela, Mom, Victoria,
everyone.
Brenda.
I like all the waving, Elise. It's just what you were talking about.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.